A few years ago, Jennifer Rosenzweig's high school students started calling her a weird nickname, the Bucket Lady.
I used to stand in the hallway with a bucket. And the kids, so I have some seniors now who had me as freshmen. I said, remember the bucket days?
Rosenzweig teaches English at Scarsdale High School in New York State. She's been a teacher for almost 20 years. But about a decade ago, she says things really changed. She started noticing kids were on their phones all day, at lunch and in class. They were having a hard time focusing. And to her, they seemed really stressed.
When the phones are on their bodies, not their fault if you don't take them off their bodies, they're getting buzzes and beeps and notifications all of the time. It's overwhelming.
So she came up with a solution, the bucket.
And so every time, every day before class, she would stand out in the hallway with her clear bucket, and we'd just drop our phones in, and then she would put them on her desk and she would hold them until the end of class.
That's Hannah Cass. She's 16 years old, a senior. She had Miss Rosenzweig in 9th and 10th grades. She's in our class again this year.
And she would just talk about how mindful the whole thing was, and how important it is to separate from your device, and how there's useful times for devices and then how there's not so useful times.
Rosenzweig did not enjoy being the only phone cop. So she met with the principal and the district superintendent to convince them to pass a school-wide ban to help students.
We're in charge of them for 7 hours of the day, 5 days a week for 10 months of the year. And that ain't nothing. That's a lot. And so what this school day looks like and feels like for them matters.
And it worked. Last year, the school adopted a new policy. Instead of a bucket, there's now a caddy on every classroom door with pockets kids drop their phones into before class. Students had mixed feelings about this.
People were so annoyed.
Oh my God, the caddy.
Last year, oh my God, there was such a fuss about them.
People were just this is unnecessary and annoying, and I want to have my phone on me.
That's Hannah, again, with one of her best friends, Alexa Handel. We're going to hear more about how the cell phone debate is playing out at Scarsdale High. And everywhere.
All over the country, schools and school districts are grappling with this question of how to deal with cell phones because they have become so ubiquitous and also quite distracting.
Laura Meckler covers education for The Post. She has been tracking the growing battle over phones in schools and the many different opinions on the right approach.
We've seen this conversation going on for the last couple of years, but it really feels like we're reaching a tipping point now. Just every time I turn around, we see a new state looking at new statewide policies on cell phones, or districts banning them in their own classes, or individual schools making the decision to do so. It feels like we really have gone from sort of a steady stream to a flood.
Because this big question, what should schools do about phones in the classroom, is not going away anytime soon.
And one lady with a bucket in the hallway is not the answer.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Thursday, September 12th. It's a new school year, and that means that teachers across the country are competing with phones for their students' attention. Today, we talk with Laura about how things are looking on the front lines of that battle. So, Laura, where in the country are cell phones being banned in schools?
Well, I guess the short answer is all over. I mean, these policies are being implemented in some cases in a statewide way where you have states that are telling districts you've got to develop some sort of restrictive policy. In some cases, it's a school district by school district way, but we're really seeing this all over the place. We were interested in looking at the largest school districts to see how many of them ban cell phones. At that point, in around July, there were 7 out of the 20 largest school districts were saying no cell phones at all during the day, and another 7 were restricting them in some maybe not so strict way, for instance, not allowing them during class time.
And what are the states where, statewide, they've enacted legislation that limits cell phone access in school?
Well, so far we've seen this in Florida. Florida was the first state, and also in Indiana, Louisiana, and South Carolina. They've all enacted legislation limiting cell phone access during the school year. And they generally leave the details to the school districts, but they are required to have restrictions on cell phone use.
And why are school districts and in some cases states making this decision? What is motivating them implementing these bans?
I think it's really being driven by two things. One is by teachers who just see what a distraction this can be. I think any of us can relate to this. Any of us who've been even with a group of adults, and there's always somebody who's like looking at their phone. Maybe everybody's kind of looking at their phone halfway through dinner, checking to see this, that, or the other. Well, with kids, it's no different. And when they're in class, they're supposed to be focused on the learning at hand. And cell phones just provide this constant and really damaging distraction. Here's teacher Jennifer Rosenzweig in Scarsdale talking more about this.
They need to know what it feels like for 50 minutes, right, to be uninterrupted, and then another 50 minutes, and then another 50 minutes. That is where real learning happens.
And then there also are real concerns about mental health, and that is that, especially social media, it just pounds kids' mental health day in and day out. There have been warnings about this from academics, from the Surgeon General, and the concern is that kids being too connected to their devices is just not good for them.
Hey, Laura, we actually had a conversation with the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, on Post Reports a couple months ago, in which he talked about, how he was really concerned about those mental health effects that social media and that phones have on people and specifically on young people. And he's even called on parents to establish tech-free zones where children cannot access their phones. I'm curious what research you've seen that backs this up, that makes the case that phones are harming kids and that phones are getting in the way of kids being able to learn.
We talked with researchers about this, and years of research they've found have overwhelmingly suggested that cell phone use has a negative effect on students' academic performance. There's also been survey data. For instance, high school teachers, 72% of high school teachers reported that students were being distracted by cell phones, that this was a major problem in their classrooms. That was from the Pew Research Center. So there's been a variety of research around this in terms of both the distraction and the mental health piece of it. I don't know that we have definitive data that says that this is damaging, but there's a lot of pieces that seem to be adding up for schools.
I want to get a better sense of how it is that cell phones became so ubiquitous, like in class, because I don't have kids, but I'm thinking back to when I was a student in middle school, high school. That's around the time that most kids had phones, but they had flip phones, like not smartphones. But the policy at school was, if you took your phone out during class, like it would be taken away. You're not supposed to have your phone out when you're supposed to be learning. But it seems like that has evolved, where now it's just like normal to see all kinds of kids taking out their cell phones in the middle of class, and like teachers don't really feel empowered to do anything about it. Can you explain a little bit how we got to this point where cell phone use is so widespread in schools?
So it's interesting because, cell phones have been around for a while. They're not like some brand new technology. And when they were really first introduced, federal data shows us that most schools banned them. I mean, it was pretty common for them not to be allowed. But then there became this wave of educational technology where phones were actually seen as a teaching tool. And we actually saw the percentage of schools banning them fall. And then they just became distracting. They just became so many people tethered to them all day long that this pendulum swung back in the other direction. And you started seeing schools implementing these restrictions. I think some of this was also driven by the pandemic, which is during the pandemic, people became so attached to their devices, for good reason at the time. I mean, learning actually depended on having a cell phone for many people. But coming out of that, learning may now depend on putting your cell phone away.
So tell me about some of the people who are in favor of these bans and the argument that they're making about why they're important.
I think a lot of the push is coming from teachers. They really see firsthand how distracting cell phones can be. We heard from Jennifer Rosenzweig at the top of the episode talking about collecting the phones herself, her own personal policy of the bucket. And now here's Rosenzweig again talking a little bit more about that and how she eventually saw more teachers pushing for banning phones in the classroom.
There's more teachers, even ones who weren't part of this initiative originally, that they are becoming more part of the team and having conversations with kids in the class about it. I do feel like we've tipped over into this doesn't sound weird or strange or invasive to take the phones away. I think 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it felt that way to people.
And so we really do see teachers pushing for this. In fact, so much so that in the city of Cleveland, the teachers union actually made it one of their priorities in their contract talks for there to be a cell phone ban in all their schools. And they won that as part of their contract. So starting this year, that is actually required by the union contract. So you definitely see teachers as the driver, as well as many administrators.
What I've found really interesting in hearing some of the insights from teachers who have noticed this is that it's not even just about learning or the ability to, pay attention to the teacher during class and the teacher not feel like everyone in class is zoning out and staring at their phone, but that having phones around changes all kinds of behavior and the way that kids interact with each other.
So true. And this is not just in the classroom. This is even during lunch. I talked with the superintendent of the Los Angeles city schools, and he said that it was heartbreaking for him. He'd walk into a cafeteria and he sees a table of 4 or 5 kids, and they're all staring at their phones. Nobody's talking to each other. That's a real problem when it just cuts off actual human interaction. And in Cleveland, where the teachers union pushed for this ban, they actually had teachers reporting the fact that some kids were using their phones to plan meetups where they would fight. In fact, they were using their phones to plan where they would meet up. They'd use their phones to warn each other about where the security officers were so they could avoid them. Then when the fight happened, they'd record them on their phones, and then they would use their phones to post the video of the fight onto social media. So this entire ecosystem, very negative ecosystem, all being carried out because they have this device in their pocket.
So when these bans are put in place, what do they actually look like?
Policies really vary around the country and school district by school district in many cases. In some cases, they really collect the phones at the beginning of the day, and they don't give them back to you till the end of the day. Some districts use a company called Yonder, which sells these pouches that are locking, and you are required to put your device or devices into this pocket at the beginning of the day. It is locked, and you keep the pouch with you. And then as you're leaving school at the end of the day, they just sort of swipe them against this device that unlocks the pouches. So it is a cold turkey cut off from your device for the entire day. I would say that is sort of at one end of the spectrum. Obviously, those are a lot easier than for a school to literally collect the phones, which some do. They collect them and keep them say in the front office. But of course, that is pretty logistically complicated to do. Now, the Yonder pouches work really well, but they also cost money. They're about $30 a pouch. So that's not nothing when you add it up to all the students that you need them for. But in any case, either of these policies are getting at the same thing, which is that students do not have access to their phones at all during the day.
But what about good old-fashioned, just keep your phone in your bag, and if I see it on your desk, I'm taking it away?
Sure, you can try that. And some places do that. Some places say, you're not allowed to have your phone out in class. You can have it in between classes, you can have it at lunch, but you're not allowed to have it out during class. And if I see it, you're in trouble. And some might have something in between, like we heard in Scarsdale, where they have the over-the-door, shoe holder. I think of them as shoe holders because, I had seen them used for shoes before this. So that's a way of really restricting your access to it during class, but you then get it back and you can text your friends as you're walking from one class to the other if you want to.
I'm really curious, what do students think about these cell phone bans?
It's all over the board, but I think in general, a lot of students don't like it. They are, in some cases have organized petitions on change.org and other places to try to stop it. I remember one of these petitions said something like, you're treating us like kindergartners. I also think we need to keep in mind that there is addiction behavior going on here too. We're all kind of addicted to our phones. Frankly, if someone tried to take my cell phone away, I would probably have a lot of reasons why that wasn't a good idea also, even if sometimes it might be a good idea. But students on the face of it, I think tend to push back, some of them. On the other hand, I've also heard from teachers who say that, students say they don't want it, but they actually kind of like it once it actually is in place. Because if no one has their phone, then it kind of resets the equilibrium. So you don't have to worry about texting because nobody's texting. You don't have to worry about what's happening on Instagram or Snapchat because nobody's on Instagram or Snapchat right now. So I think that students tend to settle into it once it happens. And that was the case with Hannah and Alexa, who we heard from earlier. And, they were skeptical at first.
It just sounded like very controlling, and they were like, we're trying to go back to I remember the speech, like they were trying to go back to the way we were in I don't know, the 90s or something, where you would sit outside on the quad and read a book. And we were just like, what? What is happening? But once again, I honestly don't even want to really be on my phone in class, and I really think it's kind of good that we aren't.
Oh, I love that. I love that this is her idea of this old-timey, go back to the 90s and read a book in the quad.
Evidently, the 90s is kind of how maybe we thought of the 1890s, something that happened a long, long time ago.
After the break, we turn to a more difficult part of this conversation. We hear how school shootings, like the one last week in Georgia, bring tough questions to the debate over phones in schools. We'll be right back. So, Laura, I'm not surprised to hear that kids don't like cell phone bans by and large. Obviously, there are a lot of things that kids might not like about school that are still really important, and we make them do them anyways. And I'll put my cards on the table here that, to me, it sounds like great idea. Take their phones, throw them in the ocean, just let them focus while they're at school. But what I've been interested in is your reporting on how there are some adults at schools who actually question the efficacy of these cell phone bans or think that it might not actually be the right idea. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. You do hear mixed reactions from parents, I will say. Some parents are with you, throw them away, take them away. They have no place in school, and they really campaign for that. And others, have become used to being able to reach their kids, and they're worried about being able to reach their kids in the case of an emergency. The response is call the office just like they used to, and you'll be able to reach your kid in the case of emergency. But nonetheless, parents have become used to be able to reach them directly. And so you do hear that from parents sometimes. And sadly, given the world that we live in and the country that we live in, you also hear parents worrying about what would happen if there was a school shooting. How would they be able to communicate and get in touch with their kids in that case?
And I want to point out here that we are talking after the horrific shooting at Appalachia High School in Georgia. And from what I understand, part of your reporting on that school shooting was actually talking to a family about the text messages, the text between a mom and her two daughters at that school. Can you describe a little bit about what you were able to understand of how that unfolded for them?
Yeah, it was horrible. I spoke with a mom, Sonia Turner, whose two daughters go to Appalachia High School and who is in touch with them and through their phones by text message. These kids were in this lockdown at the school with an active shooter. And, their first instinct was to text their mom. And they were saying things like, Mommy, I'm scared. And, I heard gunshots. And they're saying that a teacher got shot. And, what should I do? And the mom, is trying to keep herself together, and she's texting back and she's saying, I love you. And she's telling them to pray, and she's saying, get yourself somewhere safe. And it's, very emotional when you read what they had to say to one another. So, for sure, this was a horrific moment. And, it is possible the fact that these girls had cell phones made it a little bit easier because they did have that connection to their mom at a very scary moment.
I think what makes it so heart-wrenching to see these texts, and in your story, you have them all, you can see the back and forth, is that not only is it that parents have to be making this calculus of, in case something horrible happens at my kid's school, I want to be able to tell them that I love them, and I want to be able to send those messages in a life or death moment. And it's truly unfathomable and says a lot about the, profound tragedy of the state of school shootings and violence in schools in our country right now, but also that is the reason why we can't let kids focus at school, that there's this sort of cost-benefit analysis of, would it be better for kids to not have access to their phones? Arguably, yes, or maybe that's what the research says, but we feel like we can't because we're so afraid of not having their phones in a moment of violence.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that even as emotional as this moment was, and even reading these text messages that went back and forth, we do need to be mindful of the fact that school shootings are still rare in this country, and your chances of being in the situation of a school shooting is far less than the reality of the everyday pressures that come with having a cell phone. So I think what, experts would say is like, yes, this is an emotional thing, but in fact, that probably will not happen to you, whereas the damage of having a cell phone in class, probably will happen to you. So,
and the mental health effects and...
Exactly. So it's like you do have to, kind of weigh these risks. And this is all so raw. And I feel, almost like heartless saying like, well, this probably won't happen because obviously it will happen again. Somewhere it's going to happen again. It keeps happening. So it will happen again. I think we all know that in our guts. But nonetheless, it is still a very rare event. I think the arguments that go against maybe the stronger arguments against doing cell phone bans are a little less emotional and more logistical. These Yonder pouches, for instance, sound great, but they're expensive, or the fact that it's, actually complicated to have teachers collect the phones and then the teachers are being the cops, and that's difficult. But I will say it was interesting for me doing this reporting after the Appalachia shooting and talking with this family, having just written this story about the cell phones where I heard parents talking about the fear of school shootings. And I get it. Like, I get it. I understand it.
Yeah. Laura, I want to go back to an argument that you brought up that you've heard from some students who are against cell phone bans, where they say, look, this is technology that are a reality in our lives that we're going to be using, after we graduate and are unavoidable. And we should learn how to use them responsibly by knowing what it's like to have them with us in school. Tell me more about that, like whether that argument holds water and whether there are teachers or parents who actually agree with that.
Yes, the argument is definitely made that technology is real and just ignoring it, putting it away, abstaining is not the answer.
You got the universe in your pocket. It's dumb not to use it.
We talked with Calvin Dillon. He's a high school English teacher outside of Tampa, and he's been teaching for almost 30 years and says that blanket phone bans are not realistic, and he would really just rather find ways to help students use their phones in class responsibly.
They tend to sneak it because it's contraband, and we've turned it into this attractive thing because teenagers are going to do what you tell them not to do. So every once in a while, I'll encourage them to do some quick research on their phone so that it is a tool and it's not just the fun thing. So we'll get it out, we'll use it, we'll put it away. And then that's realistic because that's how people work. Not everybody shows up to the workplace and puts it in one of those, magnetically sealed bags.
Basically, he knows that letting kids using their phones for class opens the possibility that they're just going to get completely enveloped by the phone itself and distracted. But he also, has concerns with just trying to take them away.
If you teach a kid how to put the phone away for 10 minutes and get some work done, that's going to serve them the rest of their life.
And Hannah and Alexa, the teenagers up in New York, also said something similar.
If we go out into the real world and we have full control over our phones, right? And our phones have been locked up all day. I don't think that trains us to be more mindful.
When you show up at work, no one's going to give you a Yonder pouch to put your phone in, and, you and I, our jobs, we need our phones to do our jobs. We use them, every hour. And we have to fight the temptation, and we do fight the temptation to also be, just on social media or anywhere else that might be more fun than when we're doing at the moment. So that is real. But again, I would say that there is a difference between a teenager brain which is still fully developing, and an adult brain that hopefully has learned a little bit more how to control these impulses.
Laura, I'm curious, what are you keeping an eye out for in terms of how the phone ban issue continues to evolve and play out around the country?
Well, we haven't had any federal data on this since 2021. So that's pretty old now. 3 years old now. So I'm really curious to see when we do get good data about how many schools are actually putting these restrictions into place. We started reporting the story in, I think, June. And just a few of us reporters on the education team, we were just let's fan out and see what's happening. It seems like in the time since then, it has just been such a flood of places that have been adopting these new rules. It just seems to be coming up everywhere. And so I am just really curious if we're going to really continue to see this gain momentum, or whether we'll at some point see the pendulum start swinging back the other way.
Laura, thank you so much for talking through all this.
Thank you. And I will note that this interview was enabled by my cell phone in part.
Laura Meckler is a national education reporter for The Post. Before we go, there's one more story that caught my eye today. Early this morning, hundreds of miles above the surface of the Earth, we reached a new milestone in space exploration.
Track of SpaceX vent complete.
Valve open.
Get a good seal of that.
SpaceX conducted the first ever spacewalk by a private citizen.
SpaceX. Back at home, we all have a lot of work to do, but from here, Earth sure looks like a perfect world.
SpaceX said that the point of this historic spacewalk was to test their new form-fitting spacesuit that allows for maximum mobility.
So on this mission, it was significant because it was the first private astronaut spacewalk ever. And also they went further than any human being has traveled in space since the last of the Apollo missions in 1972.
Christian Davenport covers the space industry for The Post. And today, he actually spoke with two members of the all-civilian crew, billionaire Jared Isaacman and SpaceX engineer Sarah Gillis.
Hey, Chris. Hey, Chris. What's going on?
Hey, guys.
They talked to Chris as they floated hundreds of miles above the ocean. And Jared described what it was like to open the hatch and be exposed to the vacuum of space.
All of your senses were, on overdrive. We could feel, the pressure that you're kind of fighting against as you're opening the hatch. It was a much more intense experience because, again, every sense was being applied to it first. And the other thing is, it was honestly somewhat emotional too because it was, a 2.5-year journey to get to this point, and this is kind of one stop on a longer journey.
For more of that interview and more on the spacewalk, look for a link to Chris's reporting in our show notes. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you like these stories and want more from the Washington Post, now is a great time to become a Post subscriber. It's so easy to do. Go to washingtonpost.com/subscribe. Today's show is produced by Emma Talkoff with help from Ted Muldoon and Brenny Svirnovsky. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell. Thanks to Karina Elwood and Chastity Pratt. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.